The power of vulnerability, a story worth telling. A couple of years ago, I got a call from an event planner. I was lined up to do a speaking event, and she was struggling with something. So she said, "I'm having a hard time figuring out how to describe you on the flyer." I thought, what could be so difficult about that? I'm a researcher. But instead, I asked, "What's the struggle?" She sighed and said, "Well, I saw you speak, and I really enjoyed it. I was thinking of calling you a researcher, but I'm afraid if I do that, no one will show up because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant." Ouch. Now, on the inside, I was kind of panicking. Boring and irrelevant? Is that what people think when they hear the word researcher? My academic pride took a little hit, but I stayed cool. I responded, "Okay, so what's the alternative?" She brightened up. "Well, you're really a great storyteller. I think I'll call you a storyteller." Cue my inner academic meltdown. "You're going to call me a what?" I could feel my PhD trembling in its frame. "Storyteller? That sounds like something whimsical, like I should be wearing a cape and sprinkling magic pixie dust." But then I had a moment, a real, deep, reflective moment. I took a breath, summoned my courage, and said to myself, "You know what? I am a storyteller. I collect stories for my research. In fact, stories are the heart of everything I do. They're data with a soul. So maybe, just maybe, I'm a storyteller." But then, like any good academic clinging to titles, I added, "Why don't we just go with researcher storyteller?" And with the deadest of deadpans, she replied, "That's not a thing." So here I am today, a researcher storyteller, even if it's not a thing, to talk to you about a piece of my research that fundamentally shifted how I think, live, love, work, and parent. The research begins measuring the messy. My story really begins in the early days of my career. Picture this. I was a young, eager doctoral student, bright-eyed and ready to tackle the world with data. One of my first research professors said something that completely captivated me. "If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist." Cue the fireworks. My inner overachiever was immediately sold. Yes, I thought, I have found my academic calling. You see, I came from a social work background where we believe in loving the messiness of life. But secretly, I was more of a clean it up, organize it, and file it in a color-coded binder kind of person. Messy is good, but only if I can fix it. So, when I heard that I could measure things, define them, control them, predict them, I was in heaven. I was determined to take life's messiest, most complicated emotions and break them down into neat, digestible, and perfectly manageable parts. And I knew just where to start. Connection. Connection, the heart of it all. After 10 years as a social worker, I knew one thing for certain. Connection is everything. It's what gives meaning and purpose to our lives. Every person I've ever talked to, whether they're struggling with trauma, mental health, or social justice, talks about connection. Or, more precisely, the pain of disconnection. So, I set out to study connection. But here's the catch. When you ask people about connection, they tell you about disconnection. Ask them about love, they tell you about heartbreak. Belonging, they tell you about exclusion. The common thread in all these stories? Shame. And here's what I discovered. Shame is the fear of disconnection. It's that insidious voice inside your head whispering, "Is there something about me that, if people knew, would make me unworthy of connection?" Shame, my friends, is universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame lack the capacity for empathy and connection. And guess what? The less you talk about shame, the more it grows. It's like a gremlin you feed after midnight, except it's fueled by secrecy and silence. But what underpins shame is something even deeper: vulnerability. In order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And let me tell you, I hated vulnerability. A not-so-scientific plan: outsmart vulnerability. So in classic overachiever mode, I did what any self-respecting academic would do. I made a plan to outsmart vulnerability. Yes, you heard me. I was going to beat vulnerability back with a stick, I set aside a whole year to dive deep into vulnerability and shame, determined to come out on the other side victorious, with vulnerability lying at my feet in defeat. But, of course, you already know how this is going to end, right? 6 weeks into my research, I had to face the music. Vulnerability wasn't something you could outsmart, deconstruct, or beat into submission. It was messy, complex, and undeniably human. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, vulnerability was the birthplace of everything I was trying to understand: love, belonging, joy, creativity, and connection. In the end, my 1-year plan turned into a 6-year deep dive. Thousands of stories, hundreds of interviews, journal entries, focus groups, so much data, and what I found was astonishing. The key to connection: worthiness. When I looked at all the data, I realized there was one thing, just one, that separated the people who had a deep sense of love and belonging from those who struggled for it. One single thing. The people who felt a strong sense of love and belonging believed they were worthy of love and belonging. That's it, worthiness. The people who struggled to find connection were plagued by the same fear we all experience. Am I enough? Am I smart enough? Rich enough? Thin enough? Good enough? What I needed to understand was how to cultivate that sense of worthiness. What was it about the people who believed they were worthy that made them different? What were they doing? And most importantly, how could the rest of us get a piece of that? So, I went back through all my interviews looking specifically at the stories from people who felt worthy. And I came up with a term to describe them: wholehearted. These people were living with their whole hearts, embracing their vulnerability and imperfection. The courage to be imperfect. Here's what they had in common: courage. But not the Hollywood version of courage with capes and explosions. No, the original definition of courage comes from the Latin word cor, meaning heart. Courage originally meant to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. These wholehearted people had the courage to be imperfect. They had compassion for themselves first and then for others. Because, as it turns out, you can't really be kind to others if you're not kind to yourself. And finally, they had connection, but not just any connection. It was an authentic connection that came from letting go of who they thought they should be and embracing who they really were. Embracing vulnerability. The wholehearted also had one other thing in common. They fully embraced vulnerability. They didn't just tolerate it. They embraced it as something that made them beautiful. And here's the kicker. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable or easy. They talked about it as being necessary. They were willing to be vulnerable in the most excruciating ways, saying "I love you" first, putting themselves out there when there were no guarantees, and waiting. Yes, waiting for things outside of their control. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, that's terrifying. I grew up believing that control was the key to life. I pledged allegiance to research because research is about control and prediction, right? Well, it turns out the way to live a wholehearted life isn't about controlling or predicting anything. It's about embracing the uncertainty, the messiness, and the vulnerability that comes with being human. The breakdown, or spiritual awakening. This realization led to what I affectionately call a breakdown. My therapist, of course, prefers to call it a spiritual awakening. Toneto temehto. It was a breakdown. I had to face the truth that vulnerability wasn't something I could outsmart or avoid. It was the path to everything I wanted in life: connection, love, joy, creativity. But it was also the path to pain, fear, and uncertainty. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I avoided it. For about a year, I fought vulnerability tooth and nail. But in the end, vulnerability won. And thank God it did. Numbing vulnerability. Here's the thing about vulnerability. We live in a world that's constantly trying to numb it. We numb it with food, alcohol, work, scrolling through social media, and yes, even binge watching entire seasons of TV in one sitting. But the problem is, when we numb vulnerability, we also numb joy, gratitude, and happiness. We can't selectively numb emotions. When we numb the hard stuff, we also numb the good stuff. The call to be wholehearted. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can continue trying to avoid vulnerability, numbing ourselves to the uncertainty of life. Or we can embrace it. We can lean into the discomfort and choose to be wholehearted. And here's the most important thing I've learned. Being wholehearted doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you're willing to show up and be seen, even when there are no guarantees. It means you have the courage to be vulnerable, to be imperfect, and to believe that you are worthy of love and belonging, just as you are. So, as I stand here today, embracing my dual identity as both a researcher and a storyteller, I invite you to join me on this journey of vulnerability. It's messy, it's terrifying, and it's beautiful. Thank you.